Alright, buckle up. Because we're about to go on a trip. Not the kind where you pack a bag and check into a hotel. No. We're talking about a journey back roughly 4,600 years. Way before your great-great-grandmother's great-great-grandmother was even a thought. We're talking about ancient Sumer, a civilization so ahead of its time, so jaw-droppingly organized and spiritually rich, that even today, with all our smartphones and skyscrapers, we're still scratching our heads trying to fully understand what those people were up to. Does that give you the creeps? Because it should. Now here's the thing a lot of people get wrong when they picture ancient civilizations. They imagine primitive folks just stumbling around in the dirt, barely making fire, figuring out which berries won't make them sick. But Sumer? Sumer was something else entirely. By 2600 BC, the Sumerians were running cities. Real cities, complete with administration, trade networks, written records, and, here's the part that's going to blow your mind, towering religious monuments that scraped the sky. And we mean that almost literally. So let's get into it. Let's walk the dusty, sun-scorched streets of ancient Sumer and see what daily life actually looked like. The faith, the rituals, the politics of the divine, and those absolutely massive structures they built to honor their gods. Because if there's one thing the Sumerians were not playing around with, it was religion. Let's start with the basics. Where exactly are we? Sumer sat in a region the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, which translates pretty much to the land between the rivers. We're talking about modern-day southern Iraq, nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And that location? That was everything. Those two rivers made the surrounding land incredibly fertile. Rich, dark soil, perfect for growing wheat, barley, and legumes. It was essentially the breadbasket of the ancient world. Now you might be thinking, okay, nice farmland, big deal. But hold on. Because fertile land means surplus food. Surplus food means not everyone has to farm. And when not everyone has to farm, people start specializing. You get craftsmen, merchants, scribes, priests, soldiers, and here's where it gets wild. You get an organized religious class with enormous political power. That's the engine that drove Sumerian society. And by 2600 BC, that engine was running at full throttle. Here's something you need to understand right off the bat. In ancient Sumer, religion wasn't just something you did on certain days of the week and then forgot about the rest of the time. Religion was the operating system of everything. It was the backbone of politics, economics, agriculture, justice, and social order. The Sumerians were polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods, hundreds of them actually, and these weren't distant abstract deities sitting up in some cloud somewhere. No, these gods were considered the literal owners of the land. Not the king, not the nobles, the gods. Think about that for a second. Does that not flip everything on its head? The city of Ur? That belonged to the moon god Nana. The city of Uruk? That was the domain of Anu, the sky god, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war. One seriously complex divine figure, by the way. The city of Nippur? Sacred to Enlil, the god of wind and storms and one of the most powerful deities in the entire Sumerian pantheon. Each major city had its own patron deity. And that deity wasn't just a symbol. That deity was the reason the city existed, the reason crops grew, the reason rains came or didn't come, the reason wars were won or lost. So when a Sumerian woke up in the morning, they weren't just going about their day. They were, in a very real sense, serving a god, working for a god, living on land that belonged to a god. Now here's a question for you. If you truly believed your entire world was owned and run by divine beings who could bless you with abundance or sweep everything away with a flood, how seriously would you take your religious obligations? Yeah, that's exactly how the Sumerians felt, every single day. Now let's talk about the Ziggurats. Say the word slowly, Ziggurat. Even the name sounds ancient and powerful, doesn't it? A A ziggurat was a massive, terraced temple complex, essentially a stepped pyramid, though it was nothing like the Egyptian pyramids. While Egyptian pyramids were tombs for pharaohs, ziggurats were living religious centers. They were built to be the earthly home of the gods, a physical meeting point between the human world and the divine world. And they were enormous. We're not talking about a charming little chapel on the corner of Main Street. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, one of the most famous and well-preserved examples we have, had a base measuring approximately 64 meters long, 45 meters wide, and stood nearly 30 meters tall in its prime. That's the equivalent of a 10-story building constructed entirely by hand, with no cranes, no heavy machinery, no power tools of any kind. Just human muscle, brick by brick, layer by layer, under the blazing Mesopotamian sun. Does that not make your jaw drop? Be honest. Now, here's something interesting about how ziggurats were built. The Sumerians used sun-dried mud bricks for the inner core of the structure, and then fired bricks, much harder and more durable, for the outer surface. They also used bitumen, a naturally occurring tar-like substance, as a kind of ancient mortar and waterproofing agent. These people figured out construction techniques that were remarkably sophisticated for their time, and the result was a structure so solid, so well engineered, that portions of the Great Ziggurat of Ur are still standing today. Still standing, nearly 5,000 years later. Let that sink in for a moment. You know what else hasn't lasted 5,000 years? Probably most of the things in your living room right now. But here's what makes the ziggurat truly fascinating. It wasn't just a building. It was a theological statement. The Sumerians believed their gods lived at the tops of mountains. Problem was, southern Mesopotamia is flat. Pancake flat. There are no mountains. So what did they do? They built their own mountains. Artificial sacred peaks rising up from the flat river plains, visible for miles in every direction, saying to anyone who approached, "This is a holy place. This is where heaven and earth connect. And if you value your crops and your cattle and your life, you'd better pay attention." Pretty clever, right? You've got to hand it to them. The top of the ziggurat was where the most sacred rituals took place, and only the most senior priests ever set foot up there. Not the average person, not the farmers and merchants going about their daily business. The ziggurat was the exclusive domain of the priestly class, and that made it even more mysterious and powerful in the eyes of ordinary Sumerians. You'd look up at that massive structure from the street below and know, something profound is happening up there. Something I am not allowed to witness. Something between the gods and their servants. Does that give you a funny feeling in your gut? Because it was meant to. Now let's talk about the priests, because these guys were not messing around. The priestly class in ancient Sumer was one of the most powerful social groups in the entire civilization. They weren't just spiritual leaders. They were administrators, economists, astronomers, and gatekeepers of divine favor. The chief priest of a major temple was essentially the CEO of a massive religious corporation. Because here's the deal. The temples didn't just conduct rituals. They ran farms, they stored grain, they managed trade, they employed workers, they issued loans. The temple was the economic engine of the city, and the priests controlled the engine. Wild, right? The whole setup was essentially, the god owns everything, the priests manage everything on the god's behalf, and everyone else is a tenant. A working, contributing, ritually observant tenant, but a tenant nonetheless. And the rituals those priests conducted, they were extraordinarily detailed and precise. This wasn't just showing up, lighting a candle, saying a quick prayer, and heading home for dinner. No way. Sumerian religious rituals were elaborate, carefully choreographed ceremonies that had to be performed in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right offerings. Because the gods, much like a very particular and powerful boss, required things done their way. Any deviation could mean disaster, a failed harvest, a devastating flood, an enemy army at the gates. So what did these rituals actually look like? Picture this. Every single day, the priests would perform what was called the care of the god, a series of rituals treating the divine statue housed inside the temple as if it were a living, breathing deity. And in the minds of the Sumerians, it was. The statue wasn't just a representation of the god. It was believed to actually house the divine presence. So every morning, priests would wake the statue ceremonially, wash it, anoint it with oils, dress it in fine garments, and present it with food. Real food. Multiple meals a day, with a variety of dishes, beer included. Because apparently even ancient gods appreciated a good meal with a cold one. And what happened to all that food after it was offered? Well, after the ritual period, the temple staff, the priests and their households, would consume it. Because wasting perfectly good offerings would be, let's say, deeply impractical. So the system fed itself in a rather elegant way. You serve the gods bless the land produces food, the food feeds the priests who serve the gods. Round and round it goes. What do you think about that? A whole civilization essentially structured around keeping divine beings comfortable and satisfied. Kind of makes you think about what we build our own societies around, doesn't it? Now, the average Sumerian citizen wasn't spending their days inside the temple. But that doesn't mean ordinary people were disconnected from religious life. Far from it. Religion permeated every corner of daily existence. Most Sumerian households had small shrines, little sacred corners with personal figurines representing household deities or personal gods. Because in Sumerian theology, every individual had a personal god, a kind of divine guardian assigned specifically to you who advocated on your behalf before the greater gods. Like a heavenly lawyer, almost. You had to keep your personal god happy through prayer, offerings, and righteous behavior. If things went badly in your life, illness, financial trouble, bad luck, the common explanation was that your personal god had abandoned you, which makes you stop and think, what on earth did I do to tick off my divine advocate? Doesn't that hit different when you put it that way? But it gets more interesting. The Sumerians developed one of the earliest known theological concepts of personal moral responsibility. They believed that humans existed specifically to serve the gods. This was literally why humanity was created, according to their mythology. In the great Sumerian creation stories, the gods made humans to do the work the gods found tedious. Farming, building, maintaining the earth. Humans were, in a sense, the labor force of the divine project. And in exchange for that service, the gods provided, in theory, protection, fertility, and order. It was a cosmic transaction. You do your part, we do ours. Step out of line and all bets are off. Now, you might be wondering, what about the festivals? Because religion in ancient Sumer wasn't all solemn duty and heavy obligation. There were also massive public celebrations that brought the entire city together. And these weren't quiet, dignified affairs. These were loud, spectacular events. Processions through the streets, music from lyres, drums, and reed flutes filling the air. Food and drink shared among the population. The divine statues, normally hidden inside the inner sanctuary of the temple, would sometimes be carried out in elaborate processions, allowing ordinary people to glimpse the sacred images they would never see up close under normal circumstances. One of the most significant festivals in Sumerian religious life was the sacred marriage, a ritual union between the king and the divine, symbolically enacting the marriage of the god Dumuzi and the goddess Inanna. This ceremony was loaded with symbolic meaning. It was believed to ensure fertility for the land, abundance for the harvest, and vitality for the kingdom. The king's legitimacy was, in part, tied to his role as the earthly partner of the divine. Pretty high-stakes performance review, if you ask me. And speaking of the king, here's where things get politically fascinating. In ancient Sumer, the king wasn't quite a god himself, unlike in some other ancient cultures, but he was definitely the closest thing to divine authority on earth. The Sumerians called their kings Lugal, which literally means big man. Not exactly the most poetic title in history, but accurate. The king was considered the chosen representative of the patron deity of the city. His job was to build and maintain temples, conduct the great religious festivals, lead military campaigns when the gods demanded it, and ensure justice was upheld. Because justice, too, was a divine mandate. The famous King List, a Sumerian text that catalogues kings going back to before the Great Flood, records reign lengths that are, to put it gently, completely unbelievable. Kings ruling for tens of thousands of years. One king reportedly ruled for 43,200 years. Did that actually happen? Obviously not. But what it tells us is that the Sumerians understood kingship as something that stretched back to the very beginning of divine order. The institution of kingship, in their worldview, was handed down from heaven itself. Now, does that change the way you see the concept of political authority? That's a question worth sitting with. Let's talk about the scribes for a moment, because these guys were the unsung heroes of Sumerian civilization. Writing, one of humanity's greatest inventions, was developed right here in Sumer, around 3200 BC. By 2600 BC, it had been around for over 500 years and had evolved from simple pictographic record-keeping into a complex system called cuneiform. These wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets were used to record everything: trade transactions, legal codes, hymns to the gods, astronomical observations, and stories. Incredible stories. The scribes who mastered this system were highly educated and highly valued. They trained for years in schools called Aduba, the Sumerian word literally meaning tablet house. And what did they study? Mathematics, language, literature, and, inevitably, religious texts. Because in a theocratic society like Sumer, understanding the divine texts was as important as understanding arithmetic. And those religious texts were remarkable. The Sumerians produced some of the earliest hymns, prayers, and mythological narratives ever committed to writing. Hymns to Inanna that describe her power and beauty in language so vivid and passionate, it genuinely surprises modern readers. Laments over destroyed cities written with such raw emotion, they could have been written yesterday. And the descent of Inanna, a mythological narrative about the goddess traveling into the underworld, is a story with layers of symbolic meaning that scholars are still unpacking today. How does it feel knowing that someone carved those words into clay nearly 5,000 years ago, and we can still read them? Because that, right there, is the kind of thing that reminds you just how long humans have been trying to make sense of existence. Now let's bring this down to street level. What was day-to-day life actually like for an ordinary Sumerian in 2600 BC? Well, most people were farmers. The agricultural calendar drove everything: planting, irrigation, harvest. The rivers that gave life to Sumer also posed a constant threat. Flooding was unpredictable and sometimes catastrophic. Managing water was a communal, organized effort involving sophisticated canal systems and coordinated labor. This need for organization, many historians argue, is actually one of the main reasons complex society developed in Mesopotamia in the first place. When you need large groups of people to cooperate on massive water management projects, you need administration, you need record-keeping, you need authority structures. And so civilization, in a real sense, grew out of the necessity of irrigation. Think about that next time you turn on a faucet. Beyond farmers, Sumerian cities were bustling with merchants, craftsmen, weavers, potters, metalworkers, brewers. And yes, brewers were critically important, because beer was a staple of Sumerian diet, and was even used as currency and payment for labor. The workers who built the ziggurats were paid partly in beer. There is documented evidence of rations being issued in beer, which honestly sounds like either an incredible workplace perk or a logistical headache, depending on your perspective. Women in Sumerian society had more legal rights than women in many later ancient civilizations. They could own property, conduct business, and in some cases hold priestly roles. Female scribes existed, though they were less common than male scribes. The high priestess of the moon god Nana in Ur was one of the most prestigious religious positions in all of Sumer. In fact, one of the earliest named authors in all of human history is a woman. Enheduanna, a Sumerian high priestess and poet who lived around 2300 BC and composed hymns to Inanna that are still studied today. The first named author in history. A woman, a Sumerian priestess. Not exactly the story most people expect when they think about ancient history, is it? Now let's circle back to the cosmic picture, because there's one more aspect of Sumerian religious thought that deserves your full attention. The Sumerians had a view of the universe that was, in many ways, profoundly unsettling. Unlike some later religious traditions that promise personal immortality or paradise, the Sumerian afterlife was not a cheerful destination. The underworld, called Kur, was a dark, grim place where the dead lived a pale, shadowy existence, regardless of whether they were good or bad in life. There was no heavenly reward waiting for the righteous. There was just the underworld, gray, dusty, and joyless. This is one reason why the Sumerians placed such enormous value on life, on fame, legacy, achievement, beauty, and pleasure in the here and now. It's reflected powerfully in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great Sumerian narrative epic, one of the oldest pieces of literature ever written, where the hero, after confronting mortality, is told by a divine barmaid, when the gods created humanity, they set death aside for humanity and kept life for themselves. So fill your belly, make merry day and night, cherish the child who holds your hand, and let your wife delight in your embrace. That advice was given roughly 4,000 years ago, and honestly, on a human level, it still hits home. So here we are, at the end of our walk through ancient Sumer, a civilization that built mountains where there were none, that fed their gods multiple meals a day, dressed them in fine robes, and organized their entire economy around divine service. That invented writing so they could keep track of grain, yes, but also so they could preserve hymns of heartbreaking beauty. That built cities so complex and well organized, they still astonish engineers and archaeologists today. The Sumerians looked up at the stars and tried to understand their place in the universe. They looked at the floods that could wipe out years of work in a single night and asked why. They built enormous towers reaching toward heaven because they needed to believe the gods were close enough to hear them. And isn't that something we can all relate to? Standing in the middle of a world that feels bigger and more unpredictable than anything we can fully control, reaching up toward something we can't quite see, hoping something up there is listening? What do you think? Does knowing that people 4,600 years ago felt that same way make the world feel smaller? Or does it make the whole journey of humanity feel a little more magnificent? Because if you ask me, the Sumerians weren't just ancient history. They were the beginning of the story we're all still living. And that, my friend, is something worth thinking about long after this video ends.